The dust on the horizon shimmered like gold in the late afternoon sun as Grace Linden stared at her beloved mare, Penny, her fingers trembling around the worn leather reins. It was 1879, and Wilson, Kansas had suffered through 3 years of drought that had turned the once prosperous farming town into a hollow shell of itself. The local banker stood before her, his plump fingers already reaching for the reins, a look of feigned sympathy plastered across his face that didn't reach his greedy eyes. "You're doing the right thing, Miss Linden," Mr. Holloway said, patting the horse's chestnut flank. "This fine mare will fetch a good price and keep the debt collectors away from your father's doorstep for another month at least." Grace swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "Take good care of her," she whispered, her voice catching as she stroked Penny's velvet nose one final time. The horse nickered softly, as if sensing her distress. What Grace didn't notice was the tall figure leaning against the hitching post outside the general store, watching the exchange with keen interest. Ethan Grayson had only been in Wilson for 3 days, but he recognized desperation when he saw it. His eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat as he observed the interaction. "That was your only way out," he said, his deep voice carrying across the street as Holloway led the mare away. Grace spun around, her blue calico dress swirling around her ankles. "Excuse me," she asked, her green eyes flashing with a mixture of grief and indignation. Ethan pushed himself away from the post, crossing the dusty street with long, confident strides. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his skin tanned from long days under the western sun. Dark hair curled beneath his hat, and a thin scar ran along his jawline, a souvenir from a life lived rough. "That horse," he clarified, nodding toward Penny's retreating figure. "In these parts, a good horse is sometimes the only thing standing between survival and ruin." "I'm well aware of what I've just given away, sir," Grace replied stiffly, squaring her shoulders despite the tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. "But sometimes we do what we must for family." Ethan's expression softened. "Your father's farm, north of town," Grace studied him suspiciously. "How would you know that? Small towns talk, and I've got good ears." He extended his hand. "Ethan Grayson." After a moment's hesitation, Grace accepted the handshake. His palm was calloused, warm against her skin. "Grace Linden. And yes, our farm is north of town, though I'm not sure for how much longer. Bad crops, 3 years running. The well's nearly dry and Pa's been sick since winter." She straightened her shoulders, embarrassed by her candor with this stranger. "I should be going. There's still work to be done before sundown." "You're walking all the way to your farm?" Ethan asked, glancing at the road that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, shimmering in the heat. "I've walked farther for less," she replied simply, already turning away. Ethan watched her for a moment, admiring the proud set of her shoulders despite the circumstances. "Miss Linden," he called after her, "I've got 2 horses. Might be we could work out an arrangement." Grace paused, turning back with a wary expression. "What kind of arrangement?" "I'm looking for work. Good with horses, better with crops. I know techniques for dry farming that might help salvage what's left of your fields." She studied him, suspicion clear in her eyes. "And what would you want in return?" "Room and board. Fair wages when the crop comes in." He smiled slightly. "And a place to stable my horses." "We can't afford to pay you," Grace said bluntly. "Like I said, when the crop comes in." He held her gaze. "I've got a feeling about your land, Miss Linden. Sometimes all a place needs is a fresh pair of eyes." Grace hesitated, weighing the stranger's offer against the desperate state of their farm. Her father would be furious if she brought home a drifter, but they were running out of options. If there was even a chance this man could help them save the farm. "1 week," she finally said. You've got 1 week to prove yourself useful. After that, if Pa doesn't want you around, you'll go without argument." Ethan nodded, a smile playing at his lips. "Fair enough." He gestured toward the livery. "Shall we fetch my horses?" The walk to the livery stable was silent, tense with unspoken questions. Grace watched as Ethan collected his mounts, a sturdy buckskin gelding and a sleek black mare, and paid the stableman for their care. "This is Thunder," he said, patting the buckskin's neck. "And this beauty is Shadow. You can ride her. She's gentle enough." Grace approached the black mare cautiously, stroking her glossy neck. "She's beautiful. Best horse I've ever owned," Ethan said with obvious pride. "Never fails me, no matter the terrain." He helped Grace mount, his hands strong and steady at her waist, lifting her effortlessly onto the saddle. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her that she quickly dismissed as she adjusted her skirts. The ride to the Linden farm took them through dusty fields that should have been lush with wheat and corn. Instead, withered stalks and cracked earth stretched as far as the eye could see. Farmhouses stood abandoned, their windows like hollow eyes staring out at the unforgiving landscape. "This drought's taken a hard toll," Ethan observed, his eyes scanning the bleak terrain. Grace nodded grimly. "Many families have already headed west, those who stayed." Her voice trailed off. "Those who stayed are either stubborn or have nowhere else to go," Ethan finished for her. "Or both," Grace added with a small, sad smile. As they crested a small hill, the Linden farm came into view. It was modest, a 2-story farmhouse with peeling white paint, a large barn in need of repair, and fields that had once been the pride of the county now reduced to barren stretches of sun-baked soil. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney, and an older man sat on the porch, his gaunt frame hunched in a rocking chair. He straightened as they approached, reaching for a shotgun that leaned against the wall beside him. "That's my father," Grace warned quietly. "George Linden. He's protective." "Understandable," Ethan replied, slowing his horse as they neared the house. "Grace," George Linden called, his voice rough with age and illness. "Who's that with you, and where's Penny?" His eyes narrowed as he took in the stranger riding beside his daughter. Grace dismounted quickly, approaching the porch with measured steps. "Pa, this is Mr. Ethan Grayson. He's offered to help with the farm." She hesitated before adding, "I had to sell Penny to Holloway for the mortgage." George's face darkened. "Damn that banker to hell." "That horse was your mother's gift to you." "I know, Pa, but we needed the money." She glanced back at Ethan, who remained respectfully mounted a few paces back. "Mr. Grayson has experience with dry farming. He thinks he might be able to help us salvage something from the fields." George studied Ethan with suspicious eyes. "You a drifter boy?" "Yes, sir," Ethan replied honestly. "Been working farms from Texas to Dakota Territory. Picked up a few tricks along the way." "Tricks won't make it rain." "No, sir, they won't, but they might help your crop survive until it does." George coughed, a deep, rattling sound that shook his thin frame. Grace moved quickly to his side, her hand gentle on his shoulder until the spell passed. "1 week," George finally said, echoing his daughter's earlier terms. "You can sleep in the barn, first sign of trouble and you're gone." "Yes, sir," Ethan agreed, tipping his hat respectfully. "Thank you for the opportunity." As Grace helped her father inside, Ethan surveyed the farm with a critical eye. The challenge was immense, the soil parched, the crops failing, the well likely running dry. But beneath the despair, he sensed potential. The land had good bones, and with the right care, it could flourish again. More importantly, there was something about Grace Linden that had caught his attention. Her quiet dignity in the face of hardship, the fierce love for her family that had driven her to sacrifice her beloved horse. These were rare qualities in a world that often rewarded selfishness. Ethan led the horses to the barn, unsaddling them and settling them in with fresh water and what little hay he could find. Tomorrow, he would begin the work of saving the Linden farm. Tonight, he would rest and plan. The barn was cleaner than he expected, a testament to Grace's diligence despite their circumstances. He laid out his bedroll in an empty stall, using his saddle as a pillow. Through the barn doors, he could see the farmhouse, a single lamp glowing in the window. For the first time in years, Ethan Grayson felt something like hope stir in his chest, not just for this land, but perhaps for himself as well. Dawn broke over the Linden farm in a blaze of orange and gold, the sun already promising another scorching day. Ethan was up before first light, examining the fields and the irrigation ditches that had long since dried up. By the time Grace emerged from the farmhouse, carrying a basket of what appeared to be breakfast, he had already formulated a plan. "You're an early riser," she commented, approaching him as he stood surveying the eastern field. "Old habit," he replied, accepting the basket with a grateful nod. Inside, he found cornbread and a jar of preserves. "Thank you." "It's not much," Grace said apologetically. "It's more than I've had some mornings." He broke off a piece of the cornbread. "Your father, still sleeping. The coughing keeps him up most nights." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful as he ate. "I've been looking at your land. The soil's not bad, just parched." "You've got a creek running along the property line," Grace nodded. "It's mostly dry now. Sometimes after a rain, it'll flow for a day or two." "That's our first project then. We need to dam it at strategic points, create catch basins for when it does rain." "Even a little water, properly channeled, can make a difference." Grace's eyes widened slightly. "You really do know about farming in drought conditions." Ethan smiled. "Spent 2 years in Arizona territory. If you can grow anything there, you can grow it anywhere." He hesitated, then added, "I noticed your well pump seems to be struggling." "It's nearly dry," Grace confirmed. "We've been rationing water for weeks." "There are techniques for deepening a well without specialized equipment. If you're willing to try, we could start there." Hope flickered in Grace's eyes for the first time since Ethan had met her. "Show me," she said simply. The day passed in a blur of hard labor. Ethan taught Grace how to use a series of pipes and hand-crafted augers to deepen the existing well. By mid-afternoon, they struck a new water table, and the pump began producing clear, cool water in quantities the Lindens hadn't seen in months. George Linden watched from the porch, his skepticism gradually giving way to cautious optimism as he observed the stranger's methodical approach. When Ethan rigged a simple windmill mechanism to help draw water more efficiently, using parts salvaged from the barn and an abandoned wagon, even George had to admit the man knew his business. "Where'd you learn all this?" Grace asked as they sat in the shade of a gnarled oak tree, taking a brief rest after hours of labor. Ethan took a long drink from his canteen before answering. "My father was a wanderer, never stayed in one place long enough to put down roots. Took me all over the country, working whatever jobs came along." His eyes grew distant with memory. "Learned from Mexican farmers in Texas, Mormon settlers in Utah, miners in Colorado. Every place has its own wisdom about surviving the land." "And your mother," a shadow passed over his face. "Died when I was young. Fever took her in a mining camp in Nevada." "I'm sorry," Grace said softly. "My mother passed 5 years ago, childbirth. The baby didn't survive either." Their eyes met in shared understanding of loss. For a moment, something deeper than their practical arrangement seemed to pass between them, a recognition of kindred spirits who had weathered hardship and emerged stronger. The moment was broken when George called from the porch, another coughing fit, overtaking him. "I should see to him," Grace said, rising quickly. Ethan nodded. "I'll start on the irrigation channels." As the week progressed, Ethan's presence transformed the Linden farm. The deepened well provided reliable water, and his ingenious system of ditches and small dams meant that even the modest rainfall they received was captured and directed to where it was most needed. He repaired the windmill that had stood broken for months, installed a primitive but effective water collection system on the roof of the house and barn, and taught Grace techniques for mulching that preserved moisture in the soil. More subtle but equally important was the change in the household's spirits. George's coughing seemed to ease somewhat as better food and clean water became more available. Grace, who had carried the burden of the failing farm alone for so long, found strength in sharing the work with someone who knew what he was doing. And Ethan, who had drifted from place to place since his father's death 3 years earlier, discovered something unexpected, a sense of purpose, of belonging, that had eluded him in his wanderings. On the evening of the 7th day, the end of Ethan's promised week, the three sat on the porch after supper, watching lightning flicker on the distant horizon. "Looks like rain coming," George observed, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Would be a blessing," Grace agreed, her hands busy with mending. George cleared his throat, glancing at Ethan, who sat cleaning his revolver, a habit from years on the trail. "Been thinking, Grayson. Seems to me you've earned your keep this week." Ethan looked up, his expression carefully neutral. "Thank you, sir. Thought maybe you might want to stay on a bit longer, till harvest at least." The older man's pride was evident in the stiffness of his posture, but so was his practical recognition of their situation. A slow smile spread across Ethan's face. "I'd like that, Mr. Linden." "I'd like that very much." Grace ducked her head to hide her own smile, but not before Ethan caught a glimpse of it, warming something deep inside him that had been cold for too long. That night, the rain came, not a deluge, but a steady, soaking rain that lasted till morning. Thanks to Ethan's preparations, not a drop was wasted. The catch basins filled, the newly planted sections of field drank deeply, and for the first time in months, hope didn't seem like a fool's indulgence. As summer progressed into early autumn, the Linden farm slowly transformed. The fields, while not producing a bumper crop, yielded enough to ensure they wouldn't starve through winter. Ethan's knowledge of dry farming techniques proved invaluable, as did his seemingly endless reservoir of practical skills. He repaired the barn roof, reinforced the house foundation, and even built a small smokehouse for preserving meat. Each improvement was made with materials at hand: fallen timber from the creek bed, stones from the fields, parts salvaged from abandoned farms nearby. Grace watched him with growing admiration that gradually deepened into something more complex. She found herself looking forward to their shared work, to the quiet conversations over meals, to the rare moments when Ethan would reveal another piece of his past. For his part, Ethan discovered in Grace a woman of extraordinary strength and resilience. She worked alongside him without complaint, her slender hands becoming calloused, her fair skin tanning under the Kansas sun. Yet she maintained a gentleness with her father, a dedication to making their humble house a home that touched something in Ethan he thought had died with his mother. The change in their relationship happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. A lingering glance here, a brush of hands there, conversations that stretched late into the evening after George had retired. One afternoon in late September, they rode together to check on the creek dams after a particularly heavy rainfall. The landscape had begun to recover, patches of green appearing where before there had been only dust. Wildflowers dotted the prairie in defiant splashes of color. They dismounted by the main dam, a sturdy construction of logs, stones, and packed earth that had created a small but significant reservoir of water. "It's holding well," Ethan observed with satisfaction. "This water will see us through if the drought returns." "You've worked miracles here," Grace said, standing beside him at the water's edge. "3 months ago I was ready to give up." "You would never have given up," Ethan replied, his eyes meeting hers. "It's not in your nature." "I sold Penny," she reminded him, a shadow of old grief passing over her face. "To save your father and your home. That's not giving up, Grace. That's sacrifice." He reached out, tucking a strand of her honey-brown hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "There's a difference." Grace's breath caught at his touch. "Ethan." "I've been thinking," he said softly, his hand dropping back to his side, "about staying, not just until harvest, but longer." Hope flared in Grace's eyes. "The farm needs you," she said carefully. "Is it only the farm that needs me?" His question hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Grace looked away, then back, something resolute settling in her expression. "No," she admitted. "It's not only the farm." The kiss, when it came, felt as inevitable as the changing seasons. Ethan's lips were gentle on hers, his hands cradling her face as if she were something precious, irreplaceable. Grace leaned into him, her heart racing, her arms finding their way around his neck as the kiss deepened. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, the world seemed somehow changed brighter, more vivid, filled with possibilities that had seemed unimaginable just months before. "I should have done that weeks ago," Ethan murmured, his forehead resting against hers. Grace smiled, her fingers tracing the scar along his jawline. "We have time now." The ride back to the farm was charged with a new awareness between them, a current of unspoken promises and possibilities. As they approached the house, however, they saw a figure on the porch that made Ethan stiffen in the saddle. "Holloway," he said, his voice low and tight. "The banker." Grace's happiness dimmed instantly. "What does he want? We're not due to make a payment until next month." They dismounted in the yard, approaching the porch where Mr. Holloway stood in conversation with George. The banker's expression was smug, his portly frame outfitted in a suit that seemed ostentatious against the simple backdrop of the farm. "Ah, Miss Linden," Holloway said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "And Mr. Grayson, we were just discussing the matter of your loan." "What about it?" Grace asked, climbing the porch steps with Ethan close behind. George's face was grim. "Holloway says the bank's calling in all its loans early. Something about investors from back east getting nervous about the drought." "That's right," the banker confirmed with feigned regret. "I'm afraid we need payment in full by the end of October." "That's impossible," Grace protested. "You know we can't possibly." Now, Miss Linden," Holloway interrupted, his tone condescending. "I'm sure we can work something out. After all, your farm has seen quite an improvement lately." His eyes slid to Ethan. "Perhaps your friend has resources." Ethan's jaw tightened. "How much is owed exactly?" Holloway named a sum that made Grace blanch. It was far more than they could hope to raise, even with their improved prospects. "That's twice what was originally borrowed," George growled. "The interest is criminal." "It's all spelled out in the loan agreement, Mr. Linden. Perhaps you should have read the fine print more carefully." Holloway adjusted his waistcoat with plump fingers. "Of course, there are other options. I've had interest from cattle barons looking to expand their grazing lands. I could arrange a sale enough to cover your debt and leave something for you to start fresh elsewhere." "This is our home," Grace said firmly. "We're not selling." Holloway shrugged. "Then I'll expect payment by October 31st. Good day to you all." He tipped his hat and descended the porch steps, climbing into his waiting buggy with the self-satisfaction of a man who held all the cards. As the buggy disappeared down the road, George slumped in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 65 years. He's been planning this all along, waiting until we'd put work into the place to make it worth selling. Ethan's mind was racing. How much can we raise by the end of October? With what we've harvested plus anything we can sell, Grace did the calculations quickly. Not nearly enough. Even if we sold every head of livestock, every bushel of grain. There must be another way, Ethan insisted, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently. I've got some savings. Not much, but no, Grace interrupted. This isn't your burden to bear, Ethan. It is now, he replied simply. You and this farm. You're not just a place I'm passing through anymore. He paused, searching for words. You're where I want to stay. The confession hung in the air, simple and profound. George watched them, understanding dawning in his weathered face. After a moment, he cleared his throat. There might be another option. I've been holding something back, for an emergency. He rose slowly, disappearing into the house only to return moments later with a small leather pouch. From it, he withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Your mother's father left this to her, he explained, handing the paper to Grace. Never thought much of it, seemed like a fool's errand, but maybe now. Grace unfolded the paper carefully. It was a map, crudely drawn but with distinct landmarks marked. In one corner, an X had been drawn with the words Spanish silver scrawled beside it. A treasure map? Ethan asked, peering over her shoulder. George nodded. Your grandfather swore he found an old Spanish cache while prospecting in his younger days. Couldn't carry it all, so he hid most of it, planning to return. Never did, broke his leg badly on the way back and couldn't make the journey again. Where is this supposed treasure? Ethan asked, studying the map more closely. About 3 days' ride south, near the Oklahoma border, George replied. In the Red Hills. Grace looked skeptical. Pa, this could be nothing but an old man's fantasy. Could be, George agreed, but your grandfather wasn't one for tall tales. And right now, a chance at something is better than the certainty of nothing. Ethan studied the map with growing interest. Some of the landmarks were recognizable, a distinctive rock formation, a bend in a creek that matched what he'd seen in his travels. I know this area, he said slowly. Passed through it about a year ago. It's rugged country, but not impossible. He looked up, meeting Grace's worried gaze. It's worth investigating. We've got nothing to lose. Except time we could spend trying to raise money through more reliable means, Grace countered. What more reliable means? George asked bluntly. We've got a month, Grace. We need a miracle, not a slightly better harvest. The discussion continued into the evening, weighing the risks against their limited options. By nightfall, a decision had been reached. Ethan would ride out the next morning, following the map to its destination. If there was indeed treasure to be found, he would return with enough to save the farm. If not, they would face Holloway's deadline together and find another solution. That night, as George slept, Ethan and Grace sat on the porch steps, the map spread between them as they planned his journey. I don't like the idea of you going alone, Grace said, her fingers tracing the route marked on the weathered paper. Someone needs to stay with your father, Ethan replied gently, and keep working the farm. We can't put all our hopes on this map. She nodded reluctantly. Promise me you'll be careful. The Red Hills can be dangerous, especially for a lone rider. I've faced worse, he assured her, though they both knew the dangers were real: bandits, hostile tribes, the unforgiving landscape itself. Grace looked up at him, moonlight silvering her features. There's something else you should know before you go. She hesitated, then continued. Holloway came by last month before you arrived. He made An offer. Ethan's expression darkened. What kind of offer? Marriage, Grace said simply. He said he'd forgive the debt if I agreed to become his wife. Anger flashed in Ethan's eyes. That snake. I refused, of course, but it made selling Penny necessary. She sighed. I fear he's accelerated the loan repayment out of spite. Ethan took her hands in his. I'm coming back with that silver, Grace. Holloway won't get this farm or you. Grace's eyes searched his. And if there is no silver, then we'll find another way. He leaned forward, kissing her with a gentle intensity that conveyed more than words could express. I'm not losing you. Not to Holloway, not to anything. Dawn broke clear and cool the next morning as Ethan prepared for his journey. He packed lightly bedroll, provisions for a week, tools for digging and weapons for protection. Thunder, his sturdy buckskin, was well rested and eager for the trail. George pressed a rifle into Ethan's hands before he mounted. My father's Winchester never failed to hit what I aimed at. Ethan accepted the weapon with respect. I'll bring it back to you, sir. See that you do. And yourself with it. The older man's gruff tone couldn't disguise the genuine concern beneath. Grace stood nearby, her face composed though her eyes revealed her worry. She stepped forward as Ethan mounted, passing him a small leather pouch. Cornbread and jerky, she explained. And this. From around her neck she removed a simple silver locket. It was my mother's, for luck. Ethan took it carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket close to his heart. I'll guard it with my life. Guard yourself with your life, Grace corrected, reaching up to touch his hand where it rested on the saddle horn. The rest is just things. Leaning down, Ethan kissed her one last time, a promise sealed between them. Then, with a final nod to George, he straightened in the saddle and turned Thunder toward the south, the map securely tucked inside his jacket. Grace watched until he disappeared over the horizon, a solitary figure against the vast Kansas sky. 3 days to reach the Red Hills, she calculated. A day or two to search, depending on the accuracy of the map. 3 days to return. If all went well, Ethan would be back within 10 days, leaving them time to arrange payment to Holloway before the deadline. If all went well. The days of Ethan's absence stretched endlessly for Grace. She threw herself into work, harvesting the remaining crops, preserving food for winter, and caring for her father whose health seemed to improve with each passing day. Yet every sunset brought renewed anxiety as she calculated Ethan's progress, imagining him camped alone under the stars, following her grandfather's mysterious map. On the 4th night after his departure, a knock at the door startled Grace from her mending. Her father was already asleep, his breathing steady in the quiet house. Opening the door cautiously, she found Holloway on the porch, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "Mr. Holloway," she said coldly, "it's late for a social call." "Not social, Miss Linden, business." He removed his hat, revealing thinning hair slicked back with pomade. "May I come in?" Grace hesitated, then stepped back, allowing him entry but leaving the door open. "What business brings you here at this hour?" Holloway glanced around the modest home with barely concealed disdain. "I've been thinking about your situation. It troubles me to see a fine young woman like yourself struggling so." His smile was oily. "My offer still stands, you know. Marriage would solve your problems quite neatly." "I've already declined that offer, as you well know," Grace replied, her voice steady despite her revulsion. "Yes, well, that was before your friend went chasing after fool's gold." At Grace's startled look, he chuckled. "Small towns talk, Miss Linden. I know all about your grandfather's wild tale and Grayson's quest to find Spanish silver." Grace's heart sank. If Holloway knew of Ethan's mission, their last advantage was lost. "I've come with a proposition," Holloway continued. Agree now to marry me, and I'll extend your loan regardless of whether Grayson returns with anything of value." He stepped closer. "Think about it, Grace. Security for you and your father, comfort, position in town. And all I have to sacrifice is my happiness," Grace replied evenly. "No thank you, Mr. Holloway." The banker's facade of civility slipped, revealing the calculation beneath. "Don't be a fool, girl. Grayson won't find anything out there but dust and danger. Your grandfather was a notorious dreamer. The silver never existed." "Perhaps," Grace conceded. "But I'd rather take my chances on a dream with a good man than accept certainty with one who uses other people's misfortune to his advantage." Anger flashed in Holloway's eyes. "You'll regret this choice, Miss Linden. When the bank takes your farm and you and your father are left with nothing, remember that I offered you a way out." "Good night, Mr. Holloway," Grace said firmly, moving toward the door. He jammed his hat back on his head, his face mottled with rage. "Your cowboy won't be back," he spat. "Men like him don't stay. They drift in, make promises, then disappear when responsibility comes calling." "Ethan Grayson is a man of his word," Grace replied with conviction she genuinely felt. "Now please leave." After Holloway's departure, Grace sat long into the night, her mind racing. His confidence that Ethan would find nothing troubled her. Did he know something about the map's validity that they didn't? Or was it simply the cynicism of a man who had never believed in anything he couldn't count or own? As the days passed, Grace found herself watching the southern horizon, hoping for a glimpse of a rider returning in triumph. By the 8th day, anxiety had begun to gnaw at her constantly. By the 10th, when Ethan still hadn't appeared, worry transformed into fear. "Something's wrong," she told her father as they sat at breakfast on the morning of the 12th day. "He should have been back by now." George nodded slowly. "Could be he's still searching, or taking his time on the return journey if he's carrying something valuable. Or he could be hurt," Grace said, voicing the fear that had kept her awake for the past 2 nights. Alone out there with no one to help him. Her father studied her across the table, seeing the depth of her concern. "You love him," he stated simply. Grace didn't deny it. "Yes, I do." George sighed, reaching across to pat her hand. "Then go find him, daughter. I'll manage here." "Pa, I can't leave you. I'm stronger now," he interrupted. "The medicine Ethan brought from town has helped with the coughing, and Mrs. Peterson from the next farm can check on me." His eyes softened. "Your mother would want you to follow your heart, Grace. So do I." That afternoon, Grace prepared for her journey. She packed supplies, checked and rechecked her father's medications, and saddled Shadow, the black mare Ethan had left behind. The horse seemed to sense the purpose of their mission, standing patiently as Grace secured her bedroll and provisions. "I'll be back in a week," she promised her father, embracing him tightly before mounting. "With Ethan." "I know you will," George replied, his weathered face creased with a smile. "You're your mother's daughter, stubborn as the day is long and twice as determined." With a final wave, Grace turned Shadow southward, following the same trail Ethan had taken 12 days earlier. She carried the original map George had insisted, saying Ethan had memorized the route and a revolver at her hip, a necessity for a woman traveling alone. The journey was arduous. Though the worst of summer's heat had passed, the days were still warm, the terrain growing increasingly rugged as she moved south toward the Red Hills. Grace followed the landmarks on the map carefully, camping each night with one eye open, alert to the dangers of the trail. On the 3rd day, she reached the distinctive rock formation marked on the map, a natural arch of red sandstone that looked like a sleeping elephant. According to the map, the treasure site was less than half a day's ride from this point, in a narrow canyon flanked by twin buttes. As Grace rode through increasingly barren landscape, Her apprehension grew. There had been no sign of Ethan, no abandoned campsites, no tracks she could identify as Thunder's. It was as if the land had swallowed him whole. Late that afternoon, as the sun began its descent, Grace spotted the twin buttes rising from the plains like sentinels. Between them lay the canyon where, if the map was accurate, Spanish silver waited to be found. She approached cautiously, alert for any movement. The canyon was narrow at its mouth, widening into a bowl-shaped depression surrounded by high walls of striated red rock. Perfect for an ambush, she thought warily, her hand resting on the revolver. "Ethan," she called, her voice echoing against the stone walls. "Ethan, are you here?" Silence answered her, broken only by the whisper of wind through scrub brush and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. Grace dismounted, leading Shadow deeper into the canyon. The horse's ears were pricked forward, alert but not alarmed, a good sign. As they rounded a bend, Grace froze. Ahead, in a small clearing, was a campsite recently used with the remains of a fire still evident. Nearby, cropping the sparse grass, was Thunder, Ethan's buckskin gelding. "Thunder!" Grace exclaimed, relief flooding through her. The horse raised his head at her voice, nickering in recognition. But where was Ethan? She secured both horses, then examined the campsite more carefully. Ethan's bedroll was spread on the ground, his saddle serving as a pillow. A tin cup sat beside the fire ring, half filled with now cold coffee. Everything suggested he had stepped away momentarily, expecting to return. "Ethan," she called again, louder this time, her voice betraying her growing fear. A faint sound answered her, not a voice, but a scraping noise coming from farther up the canyon. Grace followed it, climbing over fallen rocks, her heart pounding with each step. The noise led her to a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, barely wide enough for a man to pass through. From within came another sound, a groan, unmistakably human. "Ethan," Grace called, peering into the darkness. "Are you in there, Grace?" The response was weak, disbelieving. "Grace, is that you?" She squeezed through the opening, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dimness. The crevice opened into a small cave, and there, propped against the far wall, was Ethan. His face was pale beneath his tan, a makeshift bandage wrapped around his right thigh, dark with dried blood. "Thank God," he breathed as she rushed to his side. "How did you find me?" "I followed the map," she said simply, kneeling beside him to examine his wound. "What happened?" Ethan grimaced as she carefully lifted the edge of the bandage. "Found the silver, it's real, Grace. A Spanish payroll cache, just like your grandfather said. I was loading it when part of the cave wall collapsed, caught my leg, trapped me for hours before I could dig free." He gestured to a pile of canvas sacks nearby. "Managed to drag myself and the silver here, but couldn't go farther. The wound's not bad, but I lost blood and without leverage couldn't mount Thunder." Grace's medical assessment confirmed his words. The gash was long but not dangerously deep, though infection was beginning to set in. She cleaned it thoroughly with water from her canteen, applied a fresh bandage from her supplies, and helped Ethan drink and eat. "How long have you been trapped here?" she asked as color gradually returned to his face. "3 days, maybe 4. Lost track of time a bit." He caught her hand, squeezing it tightly. "I was beginning to think I'd die here with salvation just out of reach." "I wouldn't have let that happen," Grace assured him, returning the pressure of his fingers. "Even if I hadn't found you today, I would have kept searching." Ethan's eyes, though pained, were warm with admiration. "You're extraordinary, Grace Linden." Riding out alone, following a map to unknown territory. He shook his head in wonder. "I learned from a stubborn cowboy that sometimes you have to take risks for what matters," she replied with a small smile. "Now, let's see about this silver of yours." Together, they examined the canvas sacks Ethan had filled. Inside were tarnished silver coins bearing Spanish markings, silver ingots stamped with the royal seal, and even a few pieces of jewelry of fortune by any standard, more than enough to pay off Holloway and secure the farm's future. "Your grandfather wasn't exaggerating," Ethan said, watching Grace run her fingers over the ancient coins. "There's more, too. I couldn't get to all of it before the cave-in." "This is plenty," Grace assured him. "More than we need." They spent the night in the cave, Grace tending to Ethan's wound and building up his strength for the journey home. By morning, though still weak, he was able to stand with her support. "We'll fashion a travois for you," Grace decided, assessing his condition with a practical eye. "Thunder can pull it. It won't be comfortable, but it will get you home." "Always the problem solver," Ethan said with admiration, leaning on her as they made their way slowly back to the campsite. Using branches and Ethan's bedroll, Grace constructed a sturdy travois that could be pulled behind Thunder. They packed the silver carefully, distributing the weight to make travel easier for the horse. "Ready?" Grace asked as she helped Ethan settle onto the travois, making him as comfortable as possible. He reached up, touching her cheek tenderly. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." The journey back to the Linden farm was slow but steady. Grace set a careful pace, mindful of Ethan's injury and the precious cargo they carried. They traveled by day and camped by night, Grace changing Ethan's bandages regularly and preparing simple meals over their campfire. During these quiet evenings, as stars scattered across the vast sky above them, they talked of the future, a future that now seemed filled with possibility rather than dread. "What will you do with your share of the silver?" Grace asked one night, sitting beside Ethan as he lay on his bedroll, his injured legs stretched out toward the fire's warmth. "My share." Ethan looked puzzled. "The silver is for your farm, Grace, to pay off Holloway." "There's more than enough to do that and still leave plenty," she pointed out. "And you're the one who found it, who risked your life for it." Ethan was quiet for a moment, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "What I want," he finally said, "can't be bought with silver." Grace's heart quickened. "What do you want, Ethan?" His gaze met hers, steady and sure. "A home. A purpose, someone to build a life with." He reached for her hand. "You, Grace. If you'll have me." Joy washed through her like a cleansing rain. "I thought you'd never ask," she whispered, leaning down to kiss him beneath the star-filled Kansas sky. 6 days after leaving the canyon, they crested the final hill overlooking the Linden farm. The sight that greeted them made Grace's blood run cold. A group of men on horseback surrounded the farmhouse, and even from a distance, she recognized Holloway's portly figure dismounting on the porch. "We need to hurry," she urged, helping Ethan mount Thunder. His leg had healed enough that he could ride for short periods, though it still pained him. They approached the farm at a gallop, Grace leading the way with determination etched on her features. As they thundered into the yard, Holloway and his men, 3 rough-looking individuals who appeared to be hired muscle, turned in surprise. Well, Holloway drawled, recovering quickly. "The prodigal daughter returns, and Mr. Grayson too, looking worse for wear." His eyes narrowed. "You're too late, I'm afraid. I was just explaining to your father that the deadline has passed. The farm is now bank property." "The deadline is tomorrow," Grace countered, dismounting and moving to stand protectively in front of her father, who had emerged onto the porch. "Is it?" Holloway feigned confusion. "My records indicate otherwise." He pulled a document from his coat pocket. "According to this, payment was due by noon today." "That's a lie," George growled, stepping forward despite his frailty. "The agreement says October 31st. "Perhaps there was a clerical error," Holloway suggested with mock concern. but the document here is quite clear and legally binding. Ethan had dismounted now, moving to stand beside Grace despite his injured leg. "How convenient that your records changed while we were away," he observed coldly. Holloway shrugged. "Business is business, Mr. Grayson. The bank must protect its interests." He gestured to his men. "These gentlemen are here to ensure a smooth transition of property." "And if we refuse to leave?" Grace challenged. "Then they will remove you," Holloway replied, his pretense of civility slipping. "By force if necessary." Ethan's hand moved to his hip where his revolver hung. The three men tensed, hands hovering near their own weapons. "Wait," Grace said, her voice clear and commanding. She turned to Shadow, untying one of the canvas sacks from behind the saddle. "We have your money, Holloway. The full amount plus interest." Holloway's expression flickered between disbelief and disappointment as Grace approached, holding the heavy sack. "What's this?" "Payment in full," she stated, dropping the bag at his feet. It landed with a heavy clink of metal. "Spanish silver, more than enough to satisfy our debt." Holloway stared at the bag, then at Grace, calculation evident in his beady eyes. "Spanish silver, from where?" "That's not your concern," Ethan interjected, stepping forward despite his limp. "Count it, sign a receipt acknowledging payment, and get off this property." For a tense moment, it seemed Holloway might refuse. Then, with obvious reluctance, he knelt and opened the sack, his eyes widening at the glint of silver within. "This needs to be assessed," he hedged. "Old foreign currency. There are exchange rates to consider." "Then consider them," George said firmly, "but do it at the bank." "These coins are pure silver worth more by weight than the dollar amount of our loan." Holloway's men shifted uncomfortably, sensing the change in dynamics. The banker finally nodded, signaling them to stand down. "Very well. I'll accept this as provisional payment, pending proper valuation." He tied the sack closed. "But don't think this is over, Linden. There will be other debts, other necessities. Sooner or later you'll need the bank again." "Perhaps," Grace acknowledged, "but we'll be dealing with a different banker. I hear Mr. Thompson in Wilson is looking to expand his territory." Anger flashed across Holloway's face, but he controlled it quickly. "We'll see," he gestured to his men. "Let's go." As the unwelcome visitors rode away, their figures gradually disappearing into the distance, a sense of profound relief settled over the Linden farm. George embraced his daughter tightly, then extended his hand to Ethan. "You did it, son," he said gruffly, emotion making his voice rough. "You saved our home." "We saved it together," Ethan corrected, clasping the older man's hand firmly. "All of us." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Kansas sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace rested her head on Ethan's shoulder, a sense of peace enveloping her that she hadn't felt in years. "So what now?" she asked softly. Ethan's arm tightened around her. "Now we build. The farm needs improvements, better irrigation, new seed for spring planting, maybe some additional livestock." He paused, his voice growing more hesitant. "And there's another matter I'd like to discuss with your father." Grace lifted her head, meeting his gaze with a smile. "He already knows, Ethan, and approves, wholeheartedly." Joy lit Ethan's face. "In that case," he said, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small object, "I have something for you." In his palm lay a ring, simple but beautiful, a band of silver with a small, perfect pearl set in its center. "I made it while I was recovering in the canyon. From a bit of the Spanish silver and a pearl I've carried for luck since my Texas days." Grace's eyes filled with tears as Ethan took her hand. "Grace Linden, you gave away your horse to save your family, not knowing if you'd ever find another way out of your troubles. You took a chance on a drifter, on a treasure that might not have existed, on a future that was uncertain at best. His voice deepened with emotion. "Will you take one more chance? On me, on us, for the rest of our days?" "Yes," Grace whispered, her heart so full it seemed it might burst from her chest. 1,000 times yes. The ring slid onto her finger as if it had been made for her alone. In a way, it had crafted by the hands of the man who had seen her courage and strength when she was at her lowest, who had recognized the value in her when she felt she had nothing left to give. As Ethan's lips met hers in a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows, Grace knew that sometimes the greatest treasures weren't found in hidden canyons or ancient caches, but in the hearts of those who loved without reservation, who saw possibility where others saw only loss. From the porch, George Linden watched his daughter and her future husband with quiet satisfaction. Life had not been easy for any of them, but adversity had forged something precious and enduring a love strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. Ethan and Grace were married that November in the little church in Wilson, the entire community turning out to celebrate. The Spanish silver, far more than needed to pay off the farm's debt, allowed them to make significant improvements: a new barn, expanded fields, a deep well that would serve them even in times of drought. Some of the silver went to help neighboring farms that had fallen on hard times, discreetly arranged through the new banker, Mr. Thompson, who proved far more interested in the community's welfare than his predecessor had been. Holloway, facing scrutiny over his business practices after complaints from multiple farmers, eventually sold his interest in the bank and moved east, his dreams of acquiring the Linden farm and its mistress vanishing like morning mist under the Kansas sun. Spring brought new growth to the land, and news that the Linden family would be expanding. Grace was expecting their first child, due in the fall. Ethan, upon hearing the news, spent a week building a cradle from the finest oak he could find, his face alight with the wonder of impending fatherhood. George, whose health continued to improve under Grace's care and the reduced stress of their circumstances, took great pleasure in planning for his grandchild's arrival. He spent long hours in his workshop, crafting toys and telling anyone who would listen about the remarkable events that had saved their farm and brought Ethan into their lives. "It all started when that cowboy saw her give away her horse," he would say, his eyes twinkling. "He said that was your only way out, but he was wrong about that. Turned out it was just the beginning of their way forward together." On a warm September evening, as golden light bathed the prosperous fields of the Linden farm, Grace gave birth to a son they named Samuel George Grayson, honoring both her grandfather, whose map had changed their fortunes, and her father, whose strength had seen them through the darkest times. Ethan, holding his son for the first time, felt a completeness he had never imagined possible in his years of wandering. The restlessness that had driven him from place to place was gone, replaced by a profound sense of belonging. "Thank you," he whispered to Grace as she rested against the pillows, tired but radiant. "For what?" she asked, reaching out to touch his cheek. "For giving me a home, a purpose, a family." He gazed down at their sleeping son, then back at the woman who had made it all possible. "For being brave enough to give away your horse that day." Grace smiled, remembering the desperate young woman she had been, standing in the dusty street of Wilson, surrendering her beloved Penny to an uncertain fate. "I think she found her way back to us in a way," she said softly. Everything did. And as twilight deepened into night, the Linden Grayson farm stood as a testament to resilience, to courage, to the power of love to transform loss into gain. A single light burned in the window of the farmhouse, a beacon of hope in a sometimes harsh land. A promise kept between a woman who had risked everything and a cowboy who had recognized true worth when he saw it. For in the vast expanses of the Kansas prairie, they had found not just silver treasure but something infinitely more precious each other, and the future they would build together, one day at a time,